The CEO of a major corporation makes about 300 times more money than their typical worker. This ratio has been increasing over time. And in this video, we're going to take a look at why. Now, there's a lot of different ways to slice up this data. You can look at it by country, by industry, or even by political party. But today, let's just focus on the United States and the overall trend. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first things first, how do we know that CEOs are getting paid 300 times more than their workers? Well, we know it because the data says so. Now there's some nuance with this number. For one, it's an average. It means that the typical CEO makes around 300 times more per year than the typical worker. Second, it's not exactly 300. The exact number is closer to 347. But for the sake of rounding and ease of discussion, we'll stick with 300. Third, the source of this data is Equilar, a company that specializes in compensation data. They gather information from public companies and compile these statistics. And fourth, it's important to note that this data doesn't include benefits. So the full compensation package for both the CEO and the worker is not being considered here. Rather, it only includes salary and bonuses, not stock options or other forms of compensation like health insurance or retirement plans. That being said, Equilar also provides data on total compensation, and when we look at that, the ratios are actually much higher. The typical CEO gets paid 928 times more than the typical worker. Now, obviously, this number is much harder to interpret because benefits are extremely variable. Like, yes, health insurance and retirement plans are standard in many industries, but the value of those benefits depends on individual circumstances. If a CEO has access to a top-tier retirement plan because they've worked for the same company for 40 years, but the worker doesn't, then the ratio is going to be way off. But anyways, that's the data. Let's move on to the next part of the video. Okay, so now that we've covered the background, we have to answer the question. Why do CEOs make 300 times more than their workers? Now, there's a lot of different opinions on this topic, but to keep things relatively objective, let's review the main points made by the three main stakeholders: shareholders, employees, and economists. Alright, so starting with shareholders, they will argue that CEOs deserve their pay because they generate massive amounts of value for shareholders. Let me explain. In a market economy, all businesses are ultimately judged by how much profit they generate. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, especially if a company is considered a public good. A public good is something that benefits society as a whole, even though some people might not directly pay for it. The most common example of a public good is national defense. We don't ask soldiers if they want to join the military, and if so, what price they'd be willing to pay in taxes. Rather, the government makes that decision on behalf of the people because they understand that a strong military is necessary to protect the nation. Another example of a public good is public education. Again, not everyone wants to go to school, but it's considered a public good because it leads to positive spillover effects. An educated population tends to lead to more innovation, higher productivity, and better civic engagement. The point here is that certain things benefit society, even if some people don't directly participate. And if a business is seen as a public good, then shareholders would argue that the CEO deserves massive compensation. However, most businesses are not public goods. Take Apple, for example. Their products are nice to have, but they aren't a necessity. There's also not really any spillover effects from their business. Their iPhones don't benefit society as a whole in the same way that a well-educated populace does. And so, in this case, shareholders will say that CEOs deserve their pay because they're incentivized to maximize profits. This incentive is what drives them to create innovative products, cut costs, and grow the business. Without this incentive, shareholders would argue that the CEO wouldn't work as hard and the resulting profits would be lower. Now, of course, this assumes that maximizing profits is in the best interest of society, which is a whole other debate. But assuming it is, shareholders would say that the CEO deserves to be compensated based on how well they do at maximizing profits. The better the profits, the better the compensation. And that's how you end up with someone making millions or even billions of dollars per year. All right, moving on to the second stakeholder group, employees. Here's the thing. Employees don't like the idea that CEOs get paid 300 times more than them. So much so that it's become a common talking point during labor union negotiations. They might say something along the lines of, "Hey, the CEO is getting paid 300 times more than us. That's not fair. Can we get a raise?" Now, it's important to note that employees aren't necessarily saying that the CEO shouldn't be paid well. What they're saying is that the CEO is getting paid too much relative to them. If the CEO makes $1 million per year and the employee makes $2,000, they're fine with that. But if the CEO makes $1 million per year and the worker makes $20,000, they feel that it's unfair. And I think that goes to show that employees don't really care about absolute compensation. They care about relative compensation. How does their pay stack up to the CEO's? Now, unfortunately, this type of comparison isn't very helpful because there are some pretty big differences between a CEO and their workers. For starters, CEOs run entire companies. They make high-level decisions that affect everything from strategy to culture. On the other hand, workers typically do one specific job. Secondly, CEOs typically need to have a unique set of skills that their workers don't need to have. For example, CEOs need to be able to communicate with the media, build relationships with investors, and inspire thousands of employees to perform at a high level. These are skills that most workers don't need to develop in their day-to-day tasks. And finally, thirdly, CEOs face a lot more risk than most workers. If the company performs poorly under their watch, they could be fired. They could lose their reputation in the industry and have trouble finding a new job. Most workers don't really face that kind of pressure. And so because of these differences, it's difficult to compare the two groups fairly. Still, despite these differences, employees generally feel that the CEO is getting paid too much relative to them. And since they are the ones doing the actual work, they feel that they deserve more of the pie. And finally, we have the third stakeholder group, economists. Economists tend to fall somewhere in the middle between shareholders and employees. On the one hand, they agree with shareholders that CEOs need to be paid well to incentivize them to maximize profits. But they also agree with employees that CEOs are getting paid too much relative to their workers. Now, depending on their political leaning, economists will emphasize different aspects of this statement. But in general, they will argue that a large portion of the CEO pay is driven by stock price appreciation. When a company's stock price goes up, the CEO gets paid more. Now, again, this makes sense from a shareholder perspective. If the CEO is incentivized to increase the stock price, then shareholders will see higher returns. But the problem with this form of compensation is that it can lead to short-term thinking. CEOs are incentivized to make decisions that boost the stock price in the short term, even if those decisions do not make sense in the long term. For example, a CEO might cut jobs to reduce costs and boost profits. Now, if the company was a dying business and those cuts were necessary for the company to survive, then this would be a good decision. But if the company was perfectly healthy and those cuts would hurt the company's long-term growth prospects, then this would be a bad decision. But since the CEO is incentivized to boost the stock price in the short term, they'll probably make the cut anyways. This is why many economists argue that CEO pay should be less dependent on stock price appreciation and more dependent on metrics that align with long-term success. Ultimately, there are valid arguments on all sides of this issue. The reality is that our current system works well for shareholders, but it's not ideal for employees or society as a whole. Now, whether or not anything changes is a whole other story. Personally, I don't think it will. Shareholders are very happy with the current state of affairs, and they have the voting power to make sure that nothing changes. Employees can grumble all they want, but ultimately they need to do a good enough job at their position to retain their job and advance in their career. And economists have no real power. They can talk about ideal systems all they want, but the reality is that the free market has decided that this is the best way to compensate CEOs. And so I think it's safe to say that this trend of CEOs getting paid more and more relative to their workers will likely continue. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and until next time.